Peace, everybody. Dr. Blaney here. And you're listening to me today out of the context of something that Alan Watts said in one of his talks on DMT. So I will be interspersing what Alan Watts says about a particular DMT experience he had with my own revelations in the realm of physics and the unification of the physical forces. Now, if any of you have ever studied Carl Jung, who's one of the most prominent students of Freud, but who then later became a greater psychologist and introduced the term cosmic consciousness. Actually, that's not what he introduced the term collective consciousness. And so I would like to share one of his views. His views for his personal life is that his mind doesn't require DMT or doesn't require hallucinogens of any type because he got enough of those already. And that's kind of how I am. So I will never take DMT. But I'm very curious and interested in what DMT can bring to our perceptions and help us understand what lies beyond. For example, what is unification of physics? How can we unify the physical forces? Well, we obviously need some kind of alternative vision than what we've seen up until now. And I believe that I have, and many others are starting to have, these visions that come from the collective unconscious because the time has come for us humans to see this truth, what the unification of physics is. And so I share my view of the unification of physics in the context of a fluid dynamics approach to the flow of ether, which then flows in patterns, and those patterns make up the inertia of the mass that we see and all the things we see around us in this universe. And it turns out that Alan's DMT experience and experiment is exactly what I also saw. Now, he wasn't even thinking about physics. He just experienced this flow of stuff going into a spiral pattern, particular spiral pattern, and I also have not just visualized it, but I came to the conclusion that that's the only way that the ether can flow, by a process of reductive deduction, I guess. So the first thing Alan Watts says is that he's doing the research so that he can explain what's unexplainable. I want to share his vision and then my vision and show how they're equal, which kind of gives further credence to it, because if two or more people think of the same thing independently, there might be something to it. So here's Alan Watts.
And I am therefore recording, or in other ways studying the changes that take place. And this is naturally a difficult task. I may need to go back many times in order to get my picture straight, to see how it does it under certain different circumstances, to work out all the ramifications of it. And for me, my own reason for being interested in these things at all is that as a writer, as a philosopher, it is my great life game to describe what is allegedly undescribable. And for example, there's a drug called dimethyltryptamine, DMT for short. And this is a 40-minute run where your consciousness is really screwed up.
So Alan Watts used DMT, and he actually took notes by recording his experience into a microphone, into a tape recorder, and then later listened to the tape recorder and remembered what he could, but basically took the facts, the factual information that he said into the tape recorder and shared it in this video.
And I was told about this, and I inquired of the doctors whether it was, dangerous or harmful or would leave you with the heebie-jeebies. And they said, no, it doesn't do anything like that. It's just about 40 minutes of sheer insanity. And they said it renders people speechless. Well, I said, it won't render me speechless. Oh, they said, no, you come off it. So, all right, I said, I'll bet you anything you like. Give me a tape recorder. and give me this chemical, and I will tell you just exactly how it feels in a coherent way. Well, wow, they gave me the first shot, which was about 1.3 cc, and although there was a kind of vaguely interesting change, nothing much happened. So then they gave me 1.9 cc, I think, and then it came on. It was as if, say, your elbow, as a point in my field of vision, suddenly came at me, but in a spiral pattern, against the background that was spiraling the other direction. See, so you've got this sort of thing going on. And then this suddenly caught hold of my body, sucked it into the system, and twisted my body into the same spiral motion. And that everything started seeming to go like this, and it was all converted into brilliantly illuminated plastic. So that it became a cross between a toy shop and Times Square, vaguely menacing. And, you know, you hardly knew which way up you were. And so it was difficult, but patiently, I talked into the tape recorder every single thing that was going on and what it was like. Now, a lot of people would say, well, you shouldn't do that. That it destroys the experience when you talk about it. It doesn't. That's the funny thing about all these things, that they're much more interesting when you do some work with them.
Okay, so Alan Watts is talking about how he felt like he was drawn into a spirally moving flow. And I'm saying that was the ether that was flowing in a spiral. Okay, so, yeah, so Alan Watts said that he felt himself pulled in, you see, pulled in like a man being pulled in to a spiral pattern that was flowing one direction while the rest of the world was flowing in an equal and opposite direction, like this. So these little arrows are going that way, and there's some point at which we have equal and opposite flow, like this, which goes away and smaller into the distance. You see? And so this is an etheric flux flow pattern. Now, this is just like if you had dust in the universe. Well, a particle of dust might follow this trajectory, okay? And if it's here, it might get sucked in and get flowing in the opposite direction, or if it's over here on this side of the biphoton pair that's being formed in the Big Bang, which one photon goes in the opposite direction to the other, so these photons are entangled. So if you're a speck of dust in the receding photon, you might get sucked into it and then follow this trajectory. And if you're a speck of dust near this photon, and there's a certain pattern that if you exist in that conical pattern, if you're a piece of dust that exists in that conical pattern, then you will get sucked into that photon, into that photon's path, like Alan Watts' body got sucked in. So he must have been inside this conical. See, every creation of a photon has a conical, that's not very straight, is it? Has a conical path where anything in that will get sucked into that photon. As the etheric void fluid spirals into a vortex, which is the natural flow pattern of all fluids, including the zero viscosity, zero density fluid of the ether or the void. And the way I define it in my theory is that the void is the fluid when it's quiescent, which is sort of an impossibility, but just for theoretical, hypothetical reasons, the beginning of the universe, it was all quiescent, right? And then the Big Bang formed because quiescence is unstable. And so that fluid, that ether, begins to move, and it's like if you have zero and something, well, that something can look like infinity to the zero, because that something, which is movement, is somethingness. Okay, so we're not going to get into the theoretical parts right now. Today we're talking about Alan Watts's DMT vision, which coincides with my theory. So Alan Watts sees this receding spiral and then this moving spiral towards you, back away from you and towards you, going in opposite directions, which I say is the same exact vision I had without DMT, by deducing how ether would flow, if indeed it was perturbed, into a way that formed stable entities. Now, during the Big Bang, there was probably a lot of ether that just flowed around randomly and didn't form stable spirals. But there's one form of flow at each size scale, but let's just say the size scale that we exist in, that form of flow that's stable, that gives rise to the ability to have change and to measure time and to store information, that phenomenon that occurred is the spiral flow. And there's certain characteristics of the spiral flow which Alan Watts didn't talk about in this particular DMT experience, but which I then later talk about, such as the nature of the spiral. So let's just draw a little box here. The nature of the spiral is that it's the same at all size scales. So that must mean that there's golden spiral thingies associated with the mathematics. And so in fact, my preliminary model of a photon has, as it's, like if you took this spiral and you projected it on a plane, it would look like this, and it would look like the golden spiral. You know, like if you, I didn't draw it ahead of time, but like the golden spiral has certain mathematical constraints on it that make it, no matter how big or small you expand it or contract it, the curve is the same. That's the definition of the golden spiral. And so I'm saying that that type of flow pattern has to exist in the photon. And so if you look at, okay, so this is the top view of the photon coming at you. That's the path of the trajectory of a speck of infinitesimally small dust. And we'll just find what dust is. Dust is just more spirals because it's ultimately all fluid flowing in spirals. But the dust is just smaller spirals, at the next universe down. And so those stable entities and conglomerates of spirals that are within that, what I call fairy dust, those are what are sucked into the spirals that make up our universe. And then collectively all the smaller whorls and swirls in that have their own circular motion, add gyroscopically to give resistance to movement, which gives inertia, mass, and condensed energy. And when you take a light spiral, that is a stable vortex of the ether filled with smaller spirals, like I said, because it does have its own inertia. If you take that photon and you force it by other means, such as other things going on in the Big Bang, and you force it to go into a circle to where it's geometrically perfect and the head meets its tail, well, the inward flow of the ether in the head matches the inward flow of ether in the tail, and they superimpose upon each other mathematically and form a toroid. And that's our mass. That's our point of light, which is not really a point, but it's a toroid. That's a spiral flowing in a toroid like that. And it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, just like this point gets smaller and smaller. If you take this tubular vortex and you force it into a toroid, you'll get a flow pattern. And that is a speck of matter. And what solves the paradox, I might as well just say it now, what solves the paradox of matter and black holes having, singularities where all the space goes to a point? It doesn't go to a point. It goes to a circle. It goes to a circle. So all this, the fairy dust particles and the people that get caught in the black hole's, dotted line around it, where you get sucked into it, its event horizon, all those things that go into the black hole, they don't go into a point. They go into a toroidal circle. Okay, and so it doesn't stop in the middle. It just keeps forming that circle and going in smaller and smaller spirals as it goes around that circle. So let's draw that bigger. And I digress, but I'm just having so much fun that I just have to go ahead and tell you this. And this is explained much more deeply in my other videos that I will be making. But so if you're, if this is a black hole somewhere in there, well, let's just say this is the black hole somewhere in this, and the event horizon's out here, not to scale, of course. And so you're out here and you get sucked in. Say you're Alan Watts and you get sucked into the event horizon. So you know I mentioned that the vortex of the ether has a cone outside of which doesn't make it into the photon, but inside that cone does. That cone is called also an event horizon for the photon, and that's my contribution to physics, one of mine. But the so here's Alan Watts, and he's accidentally crosses the event horizon and gets sucked into a black hole. He doesn't go into the middle and disappear into another universe. No, he flows like this. He gets sucked into the curved pattern. Okay, but then he's going smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and it just infinitely gets smaller and smaller and faster in a circle, and that flow goes on forever in a circle. Okay, so I hope you were entertained and enticed to pursue this theory further. But now we're going to go back to Alan Watts and see what he has to say about this.
The work seems to throw something into the experience, and then it gives you another task back. And that all adds to the interest of the thing. And I found out that in working with these things, there was no further conflict between the intellect and the intuition. That the more you intellectualized, the more the intuitive insight sprung up to correspond to the intellectual.
And so what Alan Watts has just said is that if you can allow yourself to have these visionary experiences, whether it's in dark lighting, like that's how I do it, in complete blackness, only in my mind, or I might have a candle, or my eyes closed, or I could just be driving my car and get a flash of insight. But it usually comes when it's dark and my eyes aren't being stimulated, so that my mind has more, I guess, intellectual capacity to imagine. And well, that's the only way you can make progress in science, is to have that ability to imagine. And I disagree with Georgia Tech's physicist, Dr. Finkelstein, when he says that you can't imagine quantum physics. Well, to me, okay, maybe that's a fact. You can't imagine quantum physics. I would agree. Okay, I would agree with what he said. But to me, that's just a sign that quantum physics can't go any further if you can't even imagine. Because if you can't imagine, how are you going to take the math to the next level? I think that if you imagine a universe starting from the ether, from the void actually, and then you get the ether moving and you see what form of flow patterns the fluid takes from a chemical engineering perspective, simple fluid dynamics, not necessarily simple, but simple in that it's mundane and we see it every day on this level of the universe. Well, it also holds at smaller scale. And so if you can think about the universe as a fluid, and how would it flow, and if it flowed that way, then what would happen, and then what would happen, and how would things be formed, and how does inertia form, you would then build this very universe with the molecules that we see and the biochemicals that we see in our bodies. So there's merit in allowing oneself to visualize and meditate on scientific theories. And I think that DMT, for those that are intelligent, able to record their journeys and able to report it and share it with others, can help science. Just like Alan Watts has confirmed for me, further confirmed for me, that my thoughts are valid because people on DMT are thinking of them. Some people might argue that, oh, that's proof that it's invalid. But I beg to differ, because if these visions come to people all over the world, there must be something to it. I mean, you can't just ignore that. And I wouldn't need Alan to tell me this, that it's true, that this vision is true, that fluid really flows this way, because I already knew it, because there's no other way it could flow, because there's no other way a tornado could flow. That's the way fluid flows. It's just like it flows that way because the outside fluid pushes the inside fluid a certain direction, and there's this cause and effect and this co-creation of phenomenon. And in the same way, I think that the mind on DMT, at least Alan Watts' mind on DMT on that particular trip, was tapped into that reality of the universe. And perhaps he had thought about physics himself and already knew about flow of fluids, and maybe he knew about the Bose-Einstein condensates and some of the toroidal patterns that are formed in supercooled liquids, because you see these toroidal patterns forming at very, very small scales. At, like, say, when you have liquid hydrogen, these things will spontaneously form. So these patterns of flow exist at all levels, not just the tornado, not just the big galaxy of the Milky Way that's spiraling, but also at smaller levels. Big, medium, small, and then down smaller to infinity and upward to infinity.
And that all adds to the interest of the thing. And I found out that in working with these things, there was no further conflict between the intellect and the intuition. That the more you intellectualize, the more the intuitive insight sprung up to correspond to the intellectual.
And in reverse, so he said the more you go into the deep space of meditation, the more it matches the intellectual. And I'm saying the more you go into the intellectual, the more it matches the meditative. Because my path has been to go into the intellectual and understand the mathematics of fluid flow from a chemical engineering perspective, and then apply that and the rules from that to smaller scale. And from doing that, I deduced the, indisputable properties of flow at small scales, which solve, as I guess my other videos will share with you how that happens, but it solves many of the paradoxes that we face today in physics, which are expanding universe, what's dark matter, what is matter, what is light, how does light turn into matter. It doesn't just turn into matter with a mathematical equation. There's a phenomenon that we can visualize, just like we visualize fluid flowing on our length scales of our physical, 1 to 2 meter long bodies, and the flows that we see with our little instruments. Those types of flows, at least the principles that guide those flows, also occur at smaller scale. And so it's an indisputable and inevitable conclusion if you think about it that way. And so from the intellectual viewpoint, I came to that conclusion, and Alan Watts came to the same conclusion in his meditation. And I have to admit, though, that every time I worked on the intellectual part of it in the evening with the lights off, you know how when you ride a roller coaster, you go to bed and you feel a roller coaster as you lay down to go to sleep. Well, instead of a roller coaster, I could sense all the math that I had been working on that day. And I remember I was working with my son on some of the equations, and he and I wanted him to do the computer program because I was working full time and I knew what I wanted, but I just needed someone to work it out and do it in Python. So he took this golden spiral rule, and then how fast the photon increases in space as it travels a long distance, and then the golden spiral rule. And then he showed that the side view of a Faraday particle that's trapped into the photon looks like this, like that. So it's very broad, but then it just really just shoots up, like that. So it looks like a cone. And then the side view, again, is a golden spiral, which is more like that, okay? And so I had him do that, and he plotted these out, and I have these all posted on my channel. They're very tedious to watch, but they're there. So they're all posted on the channel. And also, if you make a nice wire sculpture of this, it's beautiful, and when it twirls, it looks something like this, and you hang it from the ceiling, and it sort of has this 1 over e to the x whatever shape. And I did it out of red shiny wire, and it sort of twirls around. It's just a beautiful shape. It's almost like aesthetically beautiful. Like, how sometimes Japanese vases have these aesthetic parabolic shapes, or, so this is not only physics, but it's also aesthetically beautiful. And I think that's because it's really natural, and that's just sort of a natural phenomenon about how things flow slower and slower or faster and faster. So let's see what else Alan Watts has to say.
And so, instead of, therefore, having a session in which you just curl up and go into your own little private womb and let it take over, and you come back and all you can say is, man, it was a gas. See? So what? What's the point of going on a heroic journey and not bringing something back?
So what I want to say to that is that, and I remember my walks were around the neighborhood, lots of tall trees and blue sky, and I would think about what would help the world the most. Well, the answer has always been the same for me. It's like free, clean energy, or at least low-cost clean energy, or at least clean energy, right? Clean, safe energy. It's got to be safe. It can't be nuclear waste. It has to be clean and safe and sustainable, obviously. So what are you going to do? Well, I knew it had to do with light and somehow getting energy out of matter, but it can't be our current nuclear technology. It has to be something that you can control. And right now, we don't even know what matter and light are, so how can we think that we could make a system that would be safe? At least if we knew what matter and light was, we would at least be able to say, oh, I see what matter and light are, and there's no way we could ever make a safe energy machine. Or we might go, oh, well, if matter and light are this, then we could do our energy making machine this way, and that way we wouldn't be forming all these radioactive isotopes that that are just continue to kill people for thousands and millions of years afterwards. We would have more control and more say in what the risks were. And so I thought that I would start at the beginning, the void. That was my beginning, and then I built the universe from that, and I'm presenting now a unified theory that explains what all the forces are based on the flow of ether and the nested gyroscopic nature of all the flow patterns nested fractally within that ether. So, so I took my walks, and I didn't just, think about nothing or think about the pretty flowers for no help to mankind, although that's good too, to do that sometimes. But I actually used my creative thoughts, and I brought back with me something that'll hopefully help humanity, this one little tiny step that's like a view, a proposal for a unification theory, or at least a suggested direction towards a unification theory. Just consider what I'm saying. Consider this, if you don't like what I'm saying, consider it as an example of something that a unification theory could be. Something that's going to explain all the physical forces with one phenomenon, that is the flow of the void. The flow of the void that makes the ether, and the flow of the subsequent flow of that ether that causes circular motion and spiral vortex patterns that are stable, that are also trapped in toroids. And all of these flow patterns act to form semi-stable, meaning can last billions of years, semi-stable flow patterns that form mass. And you can't really have any kind of information storage unless you have things, entities, thingies that can be stopped in time. So that you can have this package or this pattern of stopped things to compare at this time to something in the future time that's stopped things. So by stopped things, I mean like pieces of matter that are stored in a certain way that store information, like words on a page. Those are pieces of ink molecules on paper. And you can also have, clocks with moving hands, okay? Or, but can you imagine information being stored just in light only? It would be spread out so far. And I do think that light alone can store information, but matter can store much more information in smaller regions of space. So that's where matter brings forth a new way of having consciousness and information sharing, which is ultimately kind of what two egos that love and hate come from. It comes from matter. And once you have matter, you have storage of information, and you have the opportunity for agreement versus disagreement. And that's kind of like where humans come in, because we're made of matter. We exist in a matter/light reality. Whereas if you go out into the interstices of the galaxies, where it's mostly just kind of like fluctuating ether, there's not as much information shared per cubic mile, So, I don't know, it's just a way to think about it. A bit of a digression, I guess, but nevertheless a fascinating one. Let's see if Alan Watts has anything else to say before we close.
The whole point, in every myth, heroes who take strange journeys must bring back a feather of the fabulous bird, a claw of the dragon, or the beheaded head of the villain that they slew, saying, see, here it is.
And when Alan Watts said that, I was thinking, my book that I'm working on, that book will be my feather that I bring back from the realms that I have gone into, both intellectually and meditation-wise, and in the darkness, in my own thoughts, to where I came out saying, at least for me, I understand the universe is flow of ether, and everything comes out of that. And that explains all the forces. And I want to share that in this little book. That's my feather that I've brought back from the depths.
So I always feel it's necessary in any of these adventures to bring something back. And so you get the great, intense fun, really the most stimulating thing, of saying we're going to devote this session to the study of a particular problem.
And every session that I would go to, I would devote my session to the study of a particular problem. That is the unification of physical forces based on the fluid flow theory of the void and the ether. So thank you for letting me share my thoughts versus Alan Watts' thoughts on the unification of physics. Little did Alan Watts know that he was going to be featured by my cat puppet, Alan Katz, who actually has his own comic strip. Alan Katz is a very distinguished cat, and he talks philosophy. If you like the video, please subscribe and like, and I would like to grow this channel and have conversations with you about unification of the physical forces and what types of visions or insights you've had trying to dispel the quandaries of physics up until this point, because this is the year and the decade where we will solve the unification of physical forces. Thanks everybody. Peace.